Okay, let's go. Number 1. King Aniruddha. Somewhere inside a Tibetan monastery right now, a monk is reciting a succession list that has been recited, unchanged, for close to 1,000 years. According to that list, the king currently sitting on the throne of a hidden kingdom called Shambhala took his seat in 1927. His reign runs exactly 100 years, which means it runs out in 2027. The text behind that claim is the Kalachakra Tantra, the Wheel of Time Tantra, a Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhist scripture that arrived in Tibet from India sometime in the late 10th or early 11th century. It centers on Shambhala, a kingdom the tradition holds to be real and physically hidden, protected from the outside world, ruled across history by an unbroken line of 25 kings. Each one carries the title Kalki, meaning something closer to warrior guardian than king in the way you'd normally use the word. 25 reigns, laid end to end at 100 years apiece, adds up to a single continuous clock stretching 2,500 years, and every one of those years is already accounted for on paper. Here's what makes this entry different from almost everything else on this list. Nobody has to squint at vague poetry to land on 2027. You don't need a modern interpreter reaching backward through symbolism to force a date out of it. You just run the math the text already hands you, straight down the page. Per the Mula Tantra chronology, each of those 25 kings reigns for exactly 100 years, back to back, no gaps and no overlaps, one clean handover after another for 2,500 years running, a lineage the tradition treats as continuous and unbroken from its very first ruler to its last. The 21st king, Aniruddha, took the throne in 1927. Run that fixed 100-year clock forward, no rounding, no adjustment, and his reign closes out in 2027. The king who takes over that same year, the 22nd in the line, is Narasingha, ruling by the wheel, holding the conch, and his own century on the throne runs from 2027 to 2127. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The count doesn't stop at King 22. It keeps going, all the way down the list, king after king, century after century, to the 25th and final ruler, Raudra Chakran. He is prophesied to ride out from Shambhala in the year 2424 at the head of an army to fight a last war against materialism and barbarism and to open what the tradition calls a golden age once the fighting is finished. The tradition means this literally, an actual riding out from an actual hidden kingdom. On a fixed date, the same clock has been counting toward since the reign of the very first king. I mean, think about that for a second. A text older than most of the world's standing governments has a king succession clock running right now, today, mid-reign, and that clock isn't sealed away in a museum case somewhere either. The Dalai Lama has personally performed Kalachakra initiation ceremonies in public, for audiences numbering in the tens of thousands, well into the 21st century, days-long ceremonies built around an elaborate sand mandala that gets destroyed the moment the teaching ends. People travel across the world and sit for the entire thing to receive it. Whatever you make of a 1,000-year-old countdown, it hasn't gone quiet. It's still being recited, still being taught, still being handed forward exactly the way it was 1,000 years ago, monk to monk, reign to reign, with 2027 sitting inside it as just one more handover among 25. Not the finish line, but one king closer to it. And that handover isn't sitting off in some distant century. It's the very next line on the calendar. Scholarship on this tradition doesn't treat Kalki as an isolated Tibetan curiosity either. Comparative work on Kalachakra prophecy lines Kalki up directly against the Mahdi of Islamic end times belief and the Messiah of Jewish and Christian tradition, three separate religious systems, three separate guardian at the end figures, converging on the same basic shape. Someone arrives when the count runs out. One honest hedge belongs right here, because this list only works if it earns your trust on the small things too. The exact anchor year historians assign to the very first king in the whole sequence, Suchandra, still needs pinning down against primary translation before anyone treats the 1927 to 2027 handover as beyond argument. The line itself is old, consistent, and still in religious use. But that first date is the one number in this entire segment that still wants double-checking before you take it as settled fact instead of a well-preserved tradition. Not confirmed against a primary source, not yet. Preserved, recited, and consistent across centuries of retelling. That's a different claim than proven, and this list is going to keep drawing that line all the way through. So what actually happens when a fixed 100-year reign runs out on schedule, in a lineage that has supposedly never missed a handover in 2,000 years? Does the next king already know he's next? Does anyone inside that tradition treat 2027 as anything other than an ordinary Tuesday on a much longer calendar? And if the smaller transitions inside this countdown keep landing on real calendar years without anybody forcing them to, without any modern interpreter bending the words to fit, what does that say about the date sitting at the very far end of the same clock, the year 2424? That fixed 100-year math is going to matter again later in this list, but that's getting ahead of the story. Because the next prophecy runs an even older law forward, using the same kind of arithmetic, and this time the arithmetic comes straight from the Bible, applied to events that made international headlines in the last 100 years. Number 2. Jonathan Cahn. December 1917. British General Edmund Allenby walks into Jerusalem on foot, dismounting outside the walls out of respect for the Holy City, and takes it from 4 centuries of Ottoman control without a shot fired inside the gates. That same year, the British government publishes a public letter, the Balfour Declaration, promising support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. 50 years later, almost to the anniversary, Israeli paratroopers recapture the Old City and the Temple Mount during the Six-Day War of 1967. 50 years after that, in 2017, the United States formally recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital. 3 real, documented world events, 50 years apart, every single time. That spacing comes straight out of Leviticus 25, a real, undisputed piece of Torah law that commands ancient Israel to observe a Jubilee year every 50th year. Debts canceled, land returned to its original owners, indentured servants set free. Nobody spotted this pattern after the fact and stretched it onto a calendar to make it fit. It's the actual legal code of ancient Israel, sitting in the text for close to 3,000 years before anyone thought to run it against Jerusalem's 20th century, not some fringe reading of an obscure verse. Modern prophecy teachers noticed the fit, and they didn't stay quiet about it. Jonathan Cahn, a Messianic rabbi who leads a congregation in Wayne, New Jersey, and a New York Times best-selling author of The Harbinger, The Mystery of the Shemitah, and The Book of Mysteries, has publicly taught the 1917, 1967, 2017 pattern as what he calls a 50-year Jubilean mystery, a major prophetic marker concerning the restoration of Israel, repeating on schedule 3 times, without fail. His books don't sit in some niche corner of religious publishing either. They've sold in the hundreds of thousands, landed on national bestseller lists, and turned him into one of the most recognized names in modern prophecy teaching. Mark Biltz, a pastor known widely as the Blood Moon's Pastor, after his own work correlating lunar and solar eclipse tetrads with biblical feast days back in 2008, is a second named, documented figure teaching the same 50-year cycle on the same prophecy media circuit, tying calendar mechanics to Israel's modern history the same way Cahn does. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry, by the way. An entire ancient economy resetting itself, debts wiped clean, land handed back, on a fixed 50-year clock that nobody in 1917 or 1967 or 2017 had to manufacture. It was already sitting there, waiting to be noticed. CBN News ran its own segment on this, asking the question point blank, was 2017 really the start of the Jubilee for Israel? The fact that a mainstream Christian news network felt the need to ask it in print tells you how far past the fringe this specific argument had already traveled. Here's where it gets complicated, and where the real question is what happened behind closed doors among the people doing this math. The Hebrew calendar's New Year, Rosh Hashanah, falls in autumn and doesn't line up neatly against the Gregorian dates people usually cite for the Balfour Declaration or the Six-Day War. A Jewish year that starts in September or October doesn't close on the same day a Gregorian year does, and that gap is exactly where the disagreement lives. Because of that mismatch, some prophecy teachers argue the true Jubilee window doesn't close on the clean round number anniversary of 2017 at all. They argue it runs several years past it, into a window some of them specifically name as closing around 2027, discussed with worked-out reasoning on prophecy community sites, including one called 2027, the Year of Jubilee, and another walking through the end of the world and the year 2027, using that same 50-year framework. arguing the Hebrew calendar's own internal drift is the reason the round number and the real deadline aren't the same year at all. That extended window isn't hypothetical. By this teaching's own math, it's already open, and has been for years. And this is where the pattern gets a second, completely independent leg to stand on, one worth flagging clearly right now, before you get too comfortable with just one biblical road leading here. This Jubilee cycle claim runs on a completely separate piece of scripture from another prophecy on this very list, the generation, saying out of Matthew 24, which points at its own version of 2027 through its own separate math entirely. You'll get to that one later. For now, just sit with the fact that two different scriptures, read by two different sets of teachers, using two different counting methods, are both converging on roughly the same handful of years. Neither one needs the other to work. Both of them landed here anyway. 3 real historical events. A 3,000-year-old debt forgiveness law, teachers with real names, real book deals, and real followings, all pointing at the same 50-year spacing and arguing the count still has a few years left to run. Is an ancient legal code actually tracking the 20th century's politics in Jerusalem, decade after decade, without anyone steering it there on purpose? Or are 3 genuinely convenient anniversaries, a letter, a war, and a diplomatic announcement, getting dressed up after the fact as one tidy pattern? Kahn and Biltz would tell you the pattern found them, not the other way around. Skeptics would tell you humans are wired to find 50-year gaps in almost any century you hand them if you're willing to look hard enough. The same 50-year math that made this prophecy look airtight for a century is the exact thing that's about to blow up in the next item. Because the next figure everyone quotes for prophetic credibility turns out to have confessed, in writing, to making his own prophecy up. Number 3. Mother Shipton, 1873. A man named Charles Hindley sits down and admits, in writing, that he made it up. Not all of it. Just the parts that made the whole thing famous. The parts still getting quoted today as though they came straight out of the 16th century. Back up a few centuries first. Ursula Southdale, remembered today as Mother Shipton, was born, according to tradition, around 1488 in a cave above the River Nid in Knaresborough, Yorkshire, England. She died around 1561. During her actual lifetime, she was known locally as a fortune teller and a healer, the kind of woman villages quietly consulted and just as quietly avoided naming out loud. That cave is still there, by the way. Still a tourist site in Knaresborough today, centuries after the woman supposedly born inside it died. The first printed collection of prophecies attributed to her didn't appear until 1641, a full 80 years after she was already dead, which means even that earliest printing can't be verified as her own words. It's folklore that had already attached itself to her name by the time anyone bothered writing it down, filtered through 8 decades of village retelling before a single line of it hit a printed page. Here's where Hindley comes in. In 1862, more than 200 years after that first printing, he published his own expanded edition of her prophecies, adding new material nobody in 1641 had ever seen. 11 years later, in 1873, he sat down and confessed he had fabricated several of the verses himself, including one flatly predicting the world would end in 1881. He put his own name to the confession. Nobody forced it out of him. He simply admitted it, in print, the same way he'd invented the lines in the first place. Most people never heard about this part, and that's exactly the problem, because despite a documented confession sitting in print since 1873, the fabricated verses never actually went away. Lines describing a moment when Gabriel stands on sea and shore and blows his wondrous horn, followed by 7 days and 7 nights, during which the whole world watches while tides rise and mountains seem to roar, are still copied, still shared, still presented today as the real, authentic Mother Shipton prophecy, not the confessed forgery, the real one, as if 1873 never happened. The verses get quoted on forums, printed in cheap prophecy paperbacks, read aloud on late-night radio, always missing the same footnote. The man who wrote them told everyone, in his own words, that he wrote them. Sites like futurerevealed.com still host the full text today, unlabeled, presented exactly the way Hindley wrote it a century and a half ago. And somehow, it gets worse. A Taiwan-based religious broadcaster, Supreme Master Television, aired those exact confessed fabricated verses as part of a multi-part series on ancient predictions about the planet, reading the Gabriel and 7 days imagery, as a description of a comet or an asteroid crossing the sky, something the broadcast describes as looking like a fiery dragon. From that reading, the broadcaster assigns an actual catastrophe window, November 2027 through November 2031, 4 full years, opening on a specific month of a specific year, built on top of lines a 19th century editor already admitted, in writing, to inventing more than 150 years earlier. Nobody at that broadcast has to reckon with Hindley's confession for the segment to air. The verses read the same on television whether they're genuine or not, and that's precisely the point worth sitting with. You've just seen 4 of these 10 hold up their own receipts, a confessed forgery and all. The next 6 get a lot harder to wave off. Subscribe now so the rest of this list doesn't disappear from your feed before you get to the one with a live pope in it. Because here's the honest shape of this one, laid out plainly, without dressing it up as something it isn't. A real 16th century woman existed, in a real cave, in a real English market town. A real 19th century man confessed to inventing her most famous lines, in writing, under his own name, for reasons historians still debate, whether it was profit, notoriety, or simply the fun of watching a hoax take on a life of its own. And a real, currently broadcasting network is still dating a specific modern catastrophe off those same admitted fake lines, more than 150 years after the confession, as if the paper trail runs the other direction entirely, as if the fabrication came after the broadcast, instead of a century and a half before it. Does it actually matter that the words themselves are fabricated if enough people keep repeating them as ancient wisdom anyway? A predicted date failed once already. 1881 came and went without incident, and the confessed author of that failed date is on the record admitting he wrote it for effect, not for accuracy, and certainly not for prophecy. So why does a new date, dressed in the exact same fabricated language, still find a new broadcaster and a new audience willing to take it seriously all over again, a century and a half later, as if the confession itself had never been printed? Real woman. Fake verses. A confession nobody bothered reading before quoting the exact lines it confessed to, and a 2027 date now riding on the back of all 3, unbothered by any of it. Everything that made this entry the honesty check of the list is about to work against the next one. The next prophecy was designed to stop the world from ending, not invented for clicks, and somebody rebranded it into the opposite. Number 4. The Aztec fire priests. Every fire in the empire goes dark at once. Every hearth, every temple flame, every household torch, extinguished on command, across a civilization of millions of people, and for one full night the Aztec world sits in total darkness, waiting to find out whether the sun is going to rise again the next morning at all. That ceremony is real, and it's called the New Fire Ceremony, or Toxiomolpilia, and it happened at the close of every calendar round, a cycle the Aztecs called the Xiomolpili, the binding of the years. Here's the mechanism behind it. The Aztecs ran 2 calendars at once, side by side, for the entire life of the empire. A 260-day ritual calendar called the Tonalpoali, a 365-day solar calendar called the Xiupoali. Run those 2 calendars against each other and their starting dates drift apart almost immediately, day by day, year by year, out of sync for decades at a stretch. Those 2 calendars only realign to the exact same combined starting position once every 52 years. Not close. Exact. When that alignment finally clicked back into place, the entire empire acted on it at the same time, on the same night, without exception. Priests climbed the hill of the star, Uisachtlan, outside the capital, carrying out a human sacrifice and kindling new fire by friction directly on the sacrificial victim's chest. Runners then carried that new flame down from the hill and out across the empire on foot, relighting the fire atop the Templo Mayor first, then temple by temple, household by household, until every extinguished hearth in Aztec territory was burning again, hours or days later, depending on how far the runners had to travel. The ceremony is depicted directly in the Codex Borbonicus, a 16th century painted manuscript, and it's corroborated independently by the Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagun's Florentine Codex, compiled from first-hand accounts gathered from indigenous informants after the conquest. 2 separate documentary sources describing the same ritual from 2 separate angles, not reconstructed guesswork pieced together centuries later from broken fragments. You'd think someone would have said something about how strange it is to build your entire civilization's darkest night around a fire drill repeated once a lifetime. Nobody did, because that's exactly backward from how the Aztecs themselves understood it. The ceremony's whole stated purpose runs the opposite direction of a doomsday warning. Aztec cosmology held that the current era, the fifth sun, needed continual ritual maintenance just to keep existing at all, the way a fire needs fuel added to it before it goes out. A new fire ceremony completed successfully, counted as proof, delivered on schedule, generation after generation, that the world was going to keep going for another 52 years, never a warning that it might end. If that sounds bad, keep watching, because this is where a real ancient ceremony starts picking up a modern doomsday reputation it was never built to carry. A researcher named James True, publishing on Substack in 2026 under the title Dating the Next Aztec New Fire Ceremony, worked through the genuine calendrical difficulty of pinning an exact date onto this cycle given how much colonial-era record-keeping got disrupted, and concluded the next completion of the 52-year calendar round falls in 2026 or 2027. One of those 2 years is this one. That's the real, defensible calendrical math, done carefully, with the actual difficulty of the surviving colonial-era records acknowledged up front rather than smoothed over. What happened next wasn't scholarship at all. Separate from True's work entirely, informal online doomsday discussion, including a forum thread on a well-known conspiracy message board titled The Real End Date is 2027, and a 2012 blog post on a site called Archaeological Haexides titled 2027. The advent of the Fourth World and the Virtual God took that same 52-year completion date and rebranded it as an alternative apocalypse, a replacement for the Maya 2012 prediction after that one quietly failed to happen, and the internet went looking for a new expiration date to attach to the same anxiety. This part deserves to be said plainly, the same way every item on this list deserves it. It's forum and blog speculation, not scholarship, and no ancient or modern authoritative source frames the Aztec 52-year cycle itself as a warning of anything at all, which makes this the thinnest prophecy on the entire list, and it's worth naming as exactly that instead of pretending otherwise. Real calendar, tracked precisely for centuries. Real ceremony, documented in 2 independent sources. Real 2026 or 2027 completion date, worked out by a real researcher doing real calendrical work, not guessing at it. And a doomsday framing bolted on afterward, years later, by people online who simply needed a new year to be scared of once 2012 stopped working for that purpose. Nothing here was ever meant to warn anyone about anything. It was built to reassure a whole civilization that the fire would come back, and for as long as the Aztec Empire stood, generation after generation, it always did, right up until the empire itself stopped standing for entirely unrelated reasons. For a while, this list stayed on the shakiest ground it's going to hit. That's over now. Because item 5 is a real manuscript by a documented saint, and it's actively being decoded by an entire modern media ecosystem right now. Number 5. Achyutananda Das. The deity leaves the temple first, then the temple itself falls, then the whole city built around it, one of the holiest sites in Odisha, India, falls right along with it. That's the sequence a palm leaf manuscript, centuries old, lays out for the future of Puri, home to the Jagannath Temple, one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in the country. The man behind that manuscript is Achyutananda Das, a 16th century Vaishnava poet saint from Odisha, one of the 5 Panchasakha, the 5 Friends, a group of saints, alongside Balarama Das, Jagannatha Das, Yasobanta Das, and Sisu Ananta Das, credited with translating Sanskrit religious texts into Odia, the language ordinary people in the region could actually read and understand. He's remembered first for that work, opening up scripture that had been locked behind a language most of his own community couldn't read, reshaping Odia devotional literature in the process. But alongside his best-known text, the Shunya Samhita, he also left behind something else entirely, a prophetic work called the Bhavishya Malika, the Garland of the Future, composed in verse on palm leaf manuscripts and focused specifically on the end of the current age, the Kali Yuga, and the beginning of the next one, the Satya Yuga. A saint known for opening doors, in other words, also left behind one he apparently didn't want open just yet. A 13-chapter section within that corpus, sometimes catalogued separately as the Achyutananda Malika, describes the destruction of Puri directly, step by step, in a sequence that reads less like poetry and more like a report written in advance. The deity leaves the Jagannath temple first, an event described before anything else in the sequence, before any physical damage to the site itself. Then the city around the now empty temple is destroyed. Then, in the aftermath, the Kalki avatar arrives, and the text describes that arrival as the beginning of the annihilation of evildoers, starting in Odisha specifically before spreading outward across the rest of the world. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time, or at least everyone outside a fairly narrow circle of Odia language readers. Modern Indian astrologers and Odia language commentators actively circulate specific verses from the Bhavishya Malika right now, far from any dead manuscript sitting untouched in an archive. Verses they read as predicting a run of escalating disasters, earthquakes, floods, droughts, entire seasons arriving out of order, all clustered inside a specific window, 2022 through 2027. That window isn't approaching. Most of it has already passed, and what's left of it is closer to a year and a half than a decade. The same commentary cluster goes further still, attaching a claim that 2 suns will become visible in the sky and the onset of a third world war to that exact same 5-year window, framed as the final signs arriving just before Kalki himself. And no, I'm not making that up. 2 suns in the sky is genuinely part of the modern reading being circulated right now, treated with the same seriousness as the earthquakes and the droughts, sitting right next to them in the same verse breakdowns, on the same pages, presented with the same confidence as everything else on the list. The same 2 suns claim shows up again in a Scribd.com hosted compilation of these predictions, copied and re-uploaded across the wider Hindi language internet, not confined to one account or one platform. There's an active Hindi language ecosystem built entirely around this material, nowhere near a quiet, fringe corner of the internet. A dedicated social media account at Bhavishya Malika posting under the Bhavishya Malika name, and multiple YouTube channels producing new videos with titles promising to unpack 2027 to 2038 predictions. Kalki's arrival, war between India and Pakistan, and what they call the Bhavishya Malika's secrets, all of it still being produced and uploaded as of this research, not a relic from a decade ago. New videos, new breakdowns, new viewers finding it for the first time, on a schedule that has nothing to do with when Achyutananda Das actually lived, and everything to do with whatever week it happens to be online. One honest caveat belongs here before this one goes any further, because this list only works if it holds every item to the same standard it held the last 4 to, without exception. There is no direct, scholarly translated quotation from the actual historical palm leaf manuscript that ties specifically to the year 2027. Everything describing that 5-year window is modern popular commentary, asserting a window on top of the original text, not a verified line pulled straight from Achyutananda Das's own centuries-old verses, and that's a meaningfully different claim than the saint wrote this. The saint's manuscript is real, the destruction of Puri sequence inside it is real, documented, and older than the country it describes in its current form. The specific 2022 to 2027 dating is a modern layer sitting on top of that older foundation, added by people reading the text now, not something carved into the palm leaves themselves 5 centuries ago. Still, a 16th century saint best remembered for making scripture accessible to ordinary readers also left behind the one text nobody was fully meant to decode until, apparently, right now. A 5-year countdown, actively narrated, actively updated, actively argued over, in real time, on channels and accounts that didn't exist 10 years ago, by people who were not even alive when the manuscript itself was written, in a language most of them are reading in translation rather than the original. Whether that's evidence of something genuinely encoded in the verses, or just evidence of how easily an old text can be made to say whatever a modern audience is already anxious about, is left for you to decide. This manuscript gave its countdown a 5-year window, and that clock had already started. But the next entry doesn't need a modern commentator to build a countdown at all. A real pope already died inside it. Number 6. Saint Malachy. April 21st, 2025, Pope Francis dies. 16 days later, on May 7th, the conclave that follows opens inside the Sistine Chapel, and on the 4th ballot, the assembled cardinals elect Cardinal Robert. Let me say one thing, and I won't bring it up again. All 50 places like this one are now one book, the sealed vault. Yours to keep, easy to gift, and the best way to support this channel. Links below. Let's get back to the video. Francis Prevost, an American who takes the name Leo XIV, becoming the first pope from the United States in the Church's history. That alone would be a historic news cycle. But it landed on top of a document that had already been circulating for months, a document that names, in advance, exactly how many popes are left before the story ends. It's called the Prophecy of the Popes, a list of 112 short Latin mottos, each one supposedly describing a single future pope in unbroken sequence, one after another, no skipped names, and no repeats. It was first published in 1595 by a Benedictine monk named Arnold Wion in his book Lignum Vitae, The Tree of Life, and Wion attributed the whole list to Saint Malachy, a 12th century archbishop of Armagh, Ireland, said to have received the visions centuries before Wion ever printed a single word of them. The list begins with Pope Celestine II, elected in 1143. It ends with a pope identified only by a single motto, Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman, and the text says that during his reign, Rome will be destroyed and the last judgment will occur. That's the actual ending, not a metaphor added later by some later editor softening it. The document's own stated final line, sitting there in Latin since 1595, waiting for whichever pope turns out to be the last one on the list. Here's the honest part, the part worth saying plainly before going any further, exactly the way this whole list keeps saying it. Mainstream historians, and the Vatican itself, treat this document as a 16th century forgery, not a genuine 12th century vision. The leading theory is that it was produced deliberately to help a favored candidate look destined for the papacy ahead of the 1590 conclave, the same conclave Wion's book put into print 5 years later. In 1595, at a moment when a well-timed prophecy could genuinely have swayed which cardinal looked like heaven's pick, this is the document's real, contested status, not settled supernatural fact. A disputed, 4 centuries old political document, likely written for one specific election, that has somehow kept matching real popes closely enough to stay famous for 430 years past the election it was supposedly written to influence. Renaissance-era conclaves ran on exactly this kind of maneuvering. A cardinal who could be framed as the fulfillment of a centuries-old holy vision had a real edge in a college of electors who took omens seriously, and a monk with access to a printing press was in a position to manufacture that edge, whether the vision was real or not. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense, or at least the part that shouldn't line up this cleanly if the whole thing really is just Renaissance-era politicking. Multiple outlets in 2025, including Lad Bible in at least 4 separate articles, the Greek outlet Tovima, NewsX, GB News, and the Irish Star, reported a specific calculation drawn from a 2024 documentary. That calculation identifies Pope Sixtus V, elected in 1585, as sitting exactly at the prophecy's numerical midpoint, precisely 442 years after Celestine II took the throne in 1143. Apply that same 442-year span forward from Sixtus V, and it lands on the year 2027. Read that again. A 442-year gap, pulled directly out of the list's own internal structure, not invented to hit a round number, landing on the exact same year multiple other unrelated traditions on this list keep landing on too. Because the list's final name, Petrus Romanus, gets read by different interpreters as either Francis himself or whoever comes after him, Francis's actual death, in April 2025, and Leo XIV's actual election, reignited public interest in this prophecy. At almost the exact moment, the 442-year math was already spreading online. A 5 centuries old forgery got handed a real pope, a real death, and a real conclave to test itself against, in real time, on camera, in front of an audience that had already seen the numbers before the news broke. Nobody had to wait for a documentary crew to dramatize this one. The news cameras were already rolling for an entirely different reason, and the prophecy just happened to be sitting there waiting when they arrived. ABC News and the National Catholic Reporter both covered the conclave itself in detail. The ballots, the timeline, the new pope's first appearance. RBC Ukraine went further and connected Francis's death directly to what the prophecy says about the end of the world, in a piece published while the funeral coverage was still running. Cogwriter.com, tracking Church of God-related news, specifically documents Euronews connecting the Maliki prophecy directly to the 2027 end date claim, meaning this crossed over into at least one mainstream European broadcaster's coverage, well past tabloid coverage alone, not just aggregator sites chasing clicks off a papal death. A story that started as a numbers game on niche prophecy forums ended up on continental television inside the same year a real pope died. One honest gap remains before this goes any further. The exact documentary behind the 442-year Sixtus V calculation gets referenced across all of this 2025 coverage, but it isn't directly named in anything available for this research. Call it what it is, a 2024 documentary, and nothing more specific than that, until someone pins down the title and confirms the math firsthand, rather than through 5 layers of outlets citing each other. Real disputed document, real forgery theory the Vatican itself accepts, real conclave, real American pope, the first in the Church's entire history. A 442-year internal math problem nobody had to force, sitting there in the numbers themselves the whole time, resolving on 2027, right as the list appeared to be running out of names to assign. Out of 112 mottos published in 1595, only a handful remain unaccounted for, and Leo XIV now sits inside that final stretch, whether anyone intended it that way or not. Does a set of Latin mottos assembled in 1595 keep matching real popes by coincidence? By cherry-picked wording applied after each new election to make the fit look tighter than it is? Or because whoever wrote it in 1595 understood the rhythm of church politics better than anyone has since? Up to this point, every collision on this list has come from religion or myth. That's about to flip. Because the next one comes from 1,000 years of Chinese court astrologers logging actual disasters on an actual fixed schedule. Number 7. Chai Wang. 1966. Red guards fill the streets of Beijing. Within a year, schools shut down, temples get gutted, and a decade-long convulsion begins that will eventually touch nearly 1 billion people, reshaping an entire country from the inside out. Some of the people watching it happen already knew, on the calendar alone, without a single political briefing or a single insider source, that something like this was due. Here's the mechanism behind that. The traditional Chinese sexagenary calendar runs on a 60-year cycle, built out of 10 heavenly stems paired against 12 earthly branches. And inside that cycle, 2 specific years always fall next to each other in exactly the same order. Bingwu, the fire horse year, followed immediately by Dingwei, the fire sheep year. Because of how the calendar's fire stems specifically combine with the horse and sheep branches, that particular pairing only happens once every 60 years, never separately, never out of order, always arriving as one consecutive 2-year set. A Song Dynasty scholar named Chai Wang took that pairing seriously enough to build an entire reference text around it, the Bingding Guizhen, the mirror of Bing and Ding years, cataloging 21 separate Bingwu and Dingwei pairs across roughly 1,200 years of Chinese history, from 255 BCE all the way to 947 CE, and tying a major documented calamity to nearly every single one of them. In 255 BCE, Qin's conquest of the Western Zhou, the end of a dynasty that had lasted centuries. In 195 BCE, the death of Han Emperor Gaozu, born Liu Bang, the founder of the entire Han dynasty. In 74 BCE, the death of Han Emperor Zhao, followed immediately by the brief reign of his successor Liu He, which lasted all of 27 days before Liu He was deposed outright, one of the shortest reigns in the whole of Chinese imperial history, landing precisely inside a Bingwu-Dingwei pair. The catalog doesn't stop in antiquity either. In 1906, the Bingwu year, a storm and typhoon disaster along the southeastern Chinese coast killed an estimated 15,000 people in a matter of days. In 1907, the Dingwei year that followed directly on schedule, the Huanghuagang uprising broke out, and that same year claimed the deaths of both the Guangxu Emperor and the Empress Dowager Cixi, 2 of the most powerful figures in the entire Qing court, gone within months of each other. The most recent pair before the current one was 1966 and 1967. The exact opening years of the Cultural Revolution this section opened on, a fact multiple 2025 and 2026. Chinese language outlets specifically cite when previewing the pair now arriving. But the pattern wasn't done yet, not even close. 21 disasters logged across 1,200 years, checked and matched to the same fixed 60-year clock every single time, and that clock never actually stopped running while everyone was busy watching whatever news happened to be in front of them that decade. The next Bingwu and Dingwei pair in that same unbroken sequence is 2026 and 2027, and it's already being covered right now, in the present tense, by name, under the explicit red horse, red sheep calamity framing in the original Chinese, across multiple Chinese language outlets, including Storm Media, Yahoo Taiwan News, Urban Life HK, and Epoch Times, all previewing the pair the same clinical, matter-of-fact way they'd preview any other scheduled event on a calendar, an eclipse or a tax deadline, not a rare or a debated one. The Bingwu half of that pair isn't a forecast anymore. It's the year already underway. 1,000 years of court astrologers didn't keep a ledger like this one for entertainment, and they definitely weren't grading on a curve. So yeah, not great. One additional claim deserves a clear flag rather than a clean pass-through here, because this is exactly where a list like this earns or loses your trust. A 2025 report circulated through a Chinese diaspora outlet, peoplenewstoday.com, describes a named Buddhist monk from Mount Wutai tying the 2027 fire sheep year specifically to the death of China's current leader, Xi Jinping. That's one outlet's report of one monk's claim, not a vetted fact, and it belongs in this segment exactly as that, nothing more certain than it actually is, sitting well outside the same 1,200-year documented pattern surrounding it. That's 6 completely unrelated traditions now pointing at the same 2-year window. A Tibetan countdown, a biblical law, 2 separate confessed or acknowledged forgeries, a fresh manuscript, and a 1,200-year disaster ledger, none of them borrowing from any of the others. Subscribe now, because the next 3 include a real church-investigated apparition and a prophecy that's already missed one deadline and moved the goalposts twice. So, a 1,200-year Chinese disaster ledger checked and rechecked every 60 years, never once skipping a pair in over 2 millennia. But the next case makes even that look tame, because this next apparition comes with 4 named eyewitnesses and a church that still, 6 decades later, refuses to rule either way. This is a millennium of court scholars in an empire that took its own record-keeping seriously enough to write down which years, on a fixed schedule, kept producing catastrophe, and then checking that same logbook every single time the same 2 years rolled back around, dynasty after dynasty, without anyone needing to update the method along the way. Nothing here is astrology dressed up as history. 21 hits out of 21 tracked pairs, going back over 2,000 years of continuous record-keeping, no misses recorded anywhere in the surviving catalog, and the next entry on that same log is sitting exactly 1 year away from right now, already being written about before it even arrives. But this isn't just a Chinese court astrology story anymore, and it isn't staying inside one region or one calendar tradition either. The next entry moves the same kind of prophecy into a Catholic apparition the Church itself has never officially ruled on, 60 years and counting. Number 8. Conchita Gonzalez. June 18, 1961. 4 girls, all of them 11 or 12 years old, are playing outside a tiny village in the mountains of northern Spain when they say the Archangel Michael appears in front of them, silent, just standing there, watching them the way you'd watch someone you already knew. The village is Garabandal, in Cantabria, remote enough at the time that word of what was happening there took a while to reach the outside world at all. The girls are named Conchita Gonzalez, Mari Loli Mazon, Jacinta Gonzalez, and Mari Cruz Gonzalez, the youngest of them only 11 when it started. Over the following 4 years, from that first appearance in June 1961 through November 1965, they reported dozens more apparitions, first of the Archangel, and later of a figure they identified as the Virgin Mary herself under the title Our Lady of Mount Carmel, appearing to them repeatedly, in the same village, in front of crowds that grew larger every time word spread. The messages they described weren't vague, and they weren't small either. A coming worldwide event called The Warning, in which every living person on Earth would simultaneously see the true state of their own soul, all at once, everywhere, no exceptions, no advance preparation possible. After that, a public miracle would take place at the site itself, visible and undeniable, something the girls said would be permanent and physically detectable at Garabandal from that point forward. And beyond that, a possible chastisement. if humanity still refused to repent once the warning and the miracle had already happened and the world still hadn't changed its course. The apparition site garabandal.org still hosts the visionaries' own description of what they called simply the warning, word for word, exactly as they described it back in the 1960s. But the version you've heard? That's not the full picture. The Catholic Church, more than 60 years later, has issued no definitive ruling either confirming or condemning the Garabandal apparitions as genuinely supernatural. Not a rejection. Not an endorsement. Nothing, officially. Either way, for over 6 decades running through multiple popes and multiple generations of church investigators. That's not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It's a verifiable, documented fact about the case's official status, sitting there independent of whatever you personally believe about whether the girls saw anything real at all. Here's the detail that gets skipped over constantly whenever a specific date attaches itself to this story. The girls themselves said they would each receive individual, private advance notice shortly before the warning actually happens, personal to each of them, not a shared public countdown. But no specific calendar date was ever given by the apparition itself, not once, not to any of the 4 of them, across all 4 years of reported visits. Every date anyone has ever attached to Garabandal, including every date you're about to hear in this segment, is acknowledged, even by writers and researchers who fully believe in the apparitions, as an outside calculation layered on top of a prophecy that was deliberately left open-ended from the very beginning, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, depending on which of the 4 girls you're talking about and which decade you're asking in. All 4 maintained their accounts, under sustained public scrutiny and formal church investigation, for the rest of their lives, well into old age, through skeptical priests, through journalists looking for a scandal, through decades where the easier path would have been to just walk it back. None of them ever recanted. None of them cashed in on it either. No book deals built around a confession, no late-life reversal for a payday. Whatever actually happened to them in that village, they carried the same story to their graves. One modern analysis, published on the site nishgafiantimes.com, works out a specific date anyway. Pentecost, May 16th, 2027, arrived at by reasoning backward from an assumed miracle date of April 13th, 2028, using the visionary's own statement that the warning would land roughly a year ahead of the miracle. It's careful, worked-out math, laid out step by step with its own reasoning shown, built entirely on an assumption the apparition itself never confirmed in the first place. Take away that one assumed anchor date, and the entire calculation loses its foundation. Whatever it's worth, that date isn't years off anymore. It's under a year away. And the same source is honest about something most prophecy content never admits about itself. Earlier Garabandal date guesses have failed before, more than once, across more than 1 decade. And when a predicted date came and went with nothing happening, the same proponents simply revised their reasoning and fixed on a new likely date instead of abandoning the framework altogether or admitting the method itself might be the problem. That's not this list making an accusation from the outside. That's the pattern the source itself names, openly, in its own writing, describing its own community's track record in plain terms. A real apparition, 4 real named children who grew old defending the same story without wavering. A church that has spent 6 decades declining to say yes or no either way, sitting on the case rather than closing it. A date the apparition itself deliberately refused to give, and outsiders who keep finding one anyway, resetting the clock every time the last calculated date quietly fails and nothing happens. If a prophecy is dateless by its own design, on purpose, what does it actually mean that people keep finding a date hiding inside it regardless? The visionaries themselves refused to name a date. Outside interpreters kept doing the math anyway. The next prophecy has done something even stranger. It's moved its own deadline twice already, in writing, and openly admits it. Number 8. Conchita Gonzalez. June 18th, 1961. 4 girls, all of them 11 or 12 years old, are playing outside a tiny village in the mountains of northern Spain when they say the Archangel Michael appears in front of them, silent, just standing there, watching them the way you'd watch someone you already knew. The village is Garabandal, in Cantabria, remote enough at the time that word of what was happening there took a while to reach the outside world at all. The girls are named Conchita Gonzalez, Mari Loli Mazon, Jacinta Gonzalez, and Mari Cruz Gonzalez, the youngest of them only 11 when it started. Over the following 4 years, from that first appearance in June 1961 through November 1965, they reported dozens more apparitions, first of the Archangel, and later of a figure they identified as the Virgin Mary herself under the title Our Lady of Mount Carmel, appearing to them repeatedly in the same village, in front of crowds that grew larger every time word spread. The messages they described weren't vague, and they weren't small either. A coming worldwide event called the Warning, in which every living person on earth would simultaneously see the true state of their own soul, all at once, everywhere, no exceptions, no advance preparation possible. After that, a public miracle would take place at the site itself, visible and undeniable, something the girls said would be permanent and physically detectable at Garabandal from that point forward. And beyond that, a possible chastisement, if humanity still refused to repent once the warning and the miracle had already happened and the world still hadn't changed its course. The apparition site garabandal.org still hosts the visionaries' own description of what they called simply the warning, word for word, exactly as they described it back in the 1960s. But the version you've heard? That's not the full picture. The Catholic Church, more than 60 years later, has issued no definitive ruling either confirming or condemning the Garabandal apparitions as genuinely supernatural, not a rejection. Not an endorsement, nothing, officially, either way, for over 6 decades running through multiple popes and multiple generations of church investigators. That's not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It's a verifiable, documented fact about the case's official status, sitting there independent of whatever you personally believe about whether the girls saw anything real at all. Here's the detail that gets skipped over constantly whenever a specific date attaches itself to this story. The girls themselves said they would each receive individual, private advance notice shortly before the warning actually happens, personal to each of them, not a shared public countdown. But no specific calendar date was ever given by the apparition itself, not once, not to any of the 4 of them, across all 4 years of reported visits. Every date anyone has ever attached to Garabandal, including every date you're about to hear in this segment, is acknowledged, even by writers and researchers who fully believe in the apparitions, as an outside calculation layered on top of a prophecy that was deliberately left open-ended from the very beginning, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, depending on which of the 4 girls you're talking about and which decade you're asking in. All 4 maintained their accounts, under sustained public scrutiny and formal church investigation, for the rest of their lives, well into old age, through skeptical priests, through journalists looking for a scandal, through decades where the easier path would have been to just walk it back. None of them ever recanted. None of them cashed in on it either. No book deals built around a confession. No late-life reversal for a payday. Whatever actually happened to them in that village, they carried the same story to their graves. One modern analysis, published on the site nishgafiantimes.com, works out a specific date anyway. Pentecost, May 16th, 2027, arrived at by reasoning backward from an assumed miracle date of April 13th, 2028, using the visionary's own statement that the warning would land roughly a year ahead of the miracle. It's careful, worked-out math, laid out step by step with its own reasoning shown, built entirely on an assumption the apparition itself never confirmed in the first place. Take away that one assumed anchor date, and the entire calculation loses its foundation. Whatever it's worth, that date isn't years off anymore. It's under a year away. And the same source is honest about something most prophecy content never admits about itself. Earlier Garabandal date guesses have failed before, more than once, across more than one decade. And when a predicted date came and went with nothing happening, the same proponents simply revised their reasoning and fixed on a new likely date instead of abandoning the framework altogether or admitting the method itself might be the problem. That's not this list making an accusation from the outside. That's the pattern the source itself names, openly, in its own writing, describing its own community's track record in plain terms. A real apparition, 4 real-name children who grew old defending the same story without wavering. A church that has spent 6 decades declining to say yes or no either way, sitting on the case rather than closing it. A date the apparition itself deliberately refused to give, and outsiders who keep finding one anyway, resetting the clock every time the last calculated date quietly fails and nothing happens. If a prophecy is dateless by its own design, on purpose, What does it actually mean that people keep finding a date hiding inside it regardless? The visionaries themselves refused to name a date. Outside interpreters kept doing the math anyway. The next prophecy has done something even stranger. It's moved its own deadline twice already, in writing, and openly admits it. Number 9. Hal Lindsey. 1988. The year is supposed to matter. Millions of readers of a single best-selling book have spent most of 2 decades expecting it to matter, planning sermons around it, raising kids inside a countdown that had a real published deadline attached to it. And then it arrives, passes completely uneventfully, and nothing happens at all. No sign in the sky, no end of the age. Just another ordinary calendar flipping over into 1989 like nothing had ever been promised in the first place. Here's what that book actually promised, and where the promise came from in the first place, long before Lindsey ever put pen to paper on a bestseller nobody expected to sell the way it did. In Matthew 24, in a passage called the Olivet Discourse, Jesus tells his disciples that this generation shall not pass until a specific list of end-time signs are fulfilled, and he uses a fig tree, putting out new leaves, as the visual sign that the moment is getting close, the way any farmer would recognize a season changing. Hal Lindsey's 1970 book, The Late Great Planet Earth, reported to be the best-selling nonfiction book of the entire 1970s in the United States, outselling nearly everything else published that decade, outside of fiction, was the first major popular work to connect that generation, saying directly to the modern state of Israel's founding in 1948, treating the young nation itself as the fig tree finally putting out leaves after nearly 2,000 years of dormancy. Lindsey argued that a generation, in biblical terms, is something like 40 years, and that within 40 years of 1948, all the signs he was tracking could take place, one after another, in roughly that order. Run the math and you land, plainly, on 1988. That's the year this section opened on. That's the year that came and went with nothing to show for it, no matter how many readers had already made peace with the idea that it might be their last one. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that happens to this prediction from here forward. When 1988 passed without incident, later teachers didn't drop the framework or admit the original calculation was simply wrong. They revised the length of a generation itself, reaching for a different verse entirely, Psalm 90, verse 10, which puts the days of a human life at 60 years and 10, 70 years, or if by strength, 80 years, 80. Swap in those new lengths, and you get 2 brand new candidate dates out of the exact same 1948 starting point. No new evidence required, just a new number plugged into the same old equation. 1948 plus 70 equals 2018, and 1948 plus 80 equals 2028. Gabriel Ansley Erb, author of the book 2028 END, declaring the end from the beginning and creator of the website and video series at 2028end.com, is a specific, named, currently active proponent of that second calculation, citing the same fig tree parable directly as his basis, running the same passage Lindsey used back in 1970 through an updated number. Under that exact framework, 2027 is the final full year, sitting immediately before the calculated 2028 boundary closes, derived straight out of the same 1948 plus 80 math. Erb is actively publishing right now, in real time, to an audience that's still growing, not a separately sourced claim invented independently to fit this list. That final year doesn't start in some distant decade. It starts in a matter of months. So a book that was supposed to end in 1988 is now scheduled for 2028 instead. Moved twice, 40 years apart, using the same original 1948 starting point both times, and just changing what a generation is allowed to mean whenever the last version stopped working. Critics inside Christian scholarship itself, not outside skeptics looking to score points off believers, have said as much plainly in their own publications, aimed at their own readers. Writers at gotquestions.org and christoverall.com both note that hardly anyone today actually holds the position. Lindsey originally staked out in 1970 that the generation alive when Israel reformed in 1948 would be the very same generation to witness the end. The qualifying length of generation has already been revised upward twice, from 40 to 70 to 80 years, specifically by the critic's own account, to keep the underlying prediction alive after its first version quietly failed to arrive on schedule. Lindsay himself died recently enough that both Christianity Today and Religion News Service ran full retrospectives on his career, and both pieces circled back to this exact 1948 plus a generation framework as the thing he'll be remembered for, more than any other page he ever wrote. None of that makes him a fraud. He was working from a real verse and a real, unprecedented event, Israel becoming a nation again in 1948 after nearly 2,000 years. He just got the math wrong, and so did everyone who inherited it after him. A real best-selling book that shaped how an entire generation of American readers thought about the end of the world, decades before the internet existed to spread it further. A real missed deadline, sitting in the historical record for anyone to check. A real, still active author naming 2028 as the new boundary, with 2027 sitting directly in front of it as the last full year before the line gets crossed. And a documented history, acknowledged by believers and critics alike, of the goalposts moving exactly twice already whenever the last version didn't pan out on schedule. 40 years, then 70, then 80, each revision arriving right on cue whenever the previous deadline needed rescuing. At what point does a moving deadline stop being a prophecy and start being a pattern of people who simply don't want to let go of one verse? This prediction has already missed one deadline and moved the goalposts twice to manufacture new ones. The closing item on this list isn't built like that at all. July 1999. A quatrain about a king of terror was supposed to have already happened by now. Number 10. Nostradamus. January 13th, 1999. Astronomers working with a survey called Linear spot something new moving through the sky. A near-Earth asteroid, a little over half a mile wide, big enough to matter if it ever came close to home, small enough that nobody outside professional astronomy would have noticed the discovery at all. They catalog it and give it a name built straight out of the year they found it, 1999 AN 10. That date matters because of a verse written more than 400 years earlier. Michel de Nostradame, known to history as Nostradamus, was a 16th century French physician and astrologer who published a collection of 4-line prophetic verses, Les Prophéties, in 1555, a book that's been mined for hidden meaning almost continuously for close to 500 years since. Buried inside it, in Century 10, sits Quatrain 72, his single most famous line of all, the one line even people who've never read the rest of the book can usually quote from memory. The year 1999, 7th month, from the sky will come a great king of terror, to bring back to life the great king of the Mongols, before and after Mars, to reign by good luck. There's a reason this story is still talked about today. In the years leading up to 1999 and 2000, that quatrain was the most widely publicized single Nostradamus prediction anywhere, read at the time as pointing straight at some specific, dramatic event due to arrive in July 1999. July 1999 came. Nothing matching that description happened, at least not in a way anyone could point to cleanly, and interpreters spent the next couple of years arguing over what the verse could possibly have meant instead, some later stretching it, on sites like HoagProphecy.com, as far as the September 11th attacks 2 years afterward, trying to make the King of Terror line fit something, anything, that had actually occurred. But the asteroid discovered on that exact January day in 1999 gives the verse a completely different kind of anchor, one that doesn't require squinting at unrelated headlines to make it fit anymore. NASA and JPL's own orbital tracking confirms that 1999 AN 10 is going to pass Earth at a distance of roughly 242,000 miles, about 1 lunar distance, on August 7th, 2027. That's not a hypothetical projection, sitting years out into uncertainty, the kind of soft prediction that could quietly slide by a few years in either direction. It's a scheduled, logged, close approach, sitting right now in NASA's own Sentry Hazardous Asteroid Catalog, the same catalog that once flagged possible impact scenarios for this same asteroid in 2044 and 2046, years that sounded alarming back when they were first calculated, before refined tracking data ruled both of those scenarios out entirely. That close approach isn't a distant projection anymore either. It's less than a year and a half away and closing. That's not a typo, by the way. 1 lunar distance, tracked by NASA, logged years in advance, the same agency that tracks every other object in that catalog with the same precision it's using here. Modern Nostradamus trackers, including a project called New Prophecy Almanacs that's specifically built around year-by-year interpretation of his quatrains, have started rereading that opening line differently. Not 1999 as the year the disaster happens. 1999 as the year the object itself gets discovered, the same year printed right there in the verse, 4 centuries before anyone knew there was an asteroid to find, with the actual coming from the sky event pushed forward to the asteroid's real, scheduled 2027 close pass instead. Under that reading, the quatrain didn't fail in July 1999 at all. It just hadn't finished happening yet, and the calendar simply needed 28 more years to catch up with what the verse was actually describing. NASA didn't need Nostradamus to get that date right. It just tracked the rock until the number held. One honest caveat belongs here before this list closes out, the same kind this whole video has been carrying item after item. Skeptical commentary on this exact quatrain points out that Nostradamus's wording is vague enough from the sky, a king of terror, to be retrofitted onto almost any sky-based event that comes along. An asteroid, a war, a plane, a comet, whatever the moment happens to need it to mean at the time. That looseness is exactly why the verse survived one failed reading in 1999 and simply picked up a second, more specific one almost 30 years later without anyone having to throw the whole quatrain out. This is a documented, actively circulating reinterpretation of a 500-year-old verse. It is not a confirmed prophecy, and it shouldn't be dressed up as one just because the new anchor date happens to come from NASA instead of a psychic. A line written in 1555 named a specific year, 1999. That same year turned out to be the exact year astronomers discovered a real asteroid that will make a real NASA-tracked close pass to Earth in 2027, a pass close enough to matter and distant enough to be safe, logged years in advance the way every other object in that catalog gets logged. Nostradamus never wrote the number 2027 anywhere in his verses, not once in any translation. The paperwork got there on its own, through a survey team cataloging a rock nobody knew existed until the same year the quatrain happened to name almost 450 years earlier. The real question isn't whether Nostradamus predicted an asteroid. It's why 10 completely unrelated calendars, texts, and confessions all pointed a finger at the same 2-year window without any of them talking to each other. 10 completely different traditions, 10 completely different math problems, a Tibetan king count, a papal forgery, a disaster ledger, a manuscript, an apparition, a moved deadline, and a 500-year-old verse, all land inside the same 2-year window around 2027. That's either the most elaborate coincidence in the history of prophecy or the first one actually worth watching in real time. Tell me where you're watching this from, and subscribe for more.